This is episode 10 of the LatinNews Podcast. I'm Richard McCall, your host here in Colombia. My very special guest this week is none other than Professor Jo-Marie Burt. She's of the School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and the president of LASA. And we're going to be talking about the upcoming second round of elections in Guatemala on August the 20th. So welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Hi, Richard. Nice to be here with you.
It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure. Guatemala is a country that's very close to my heart as being the place where I first cut my teeth in Latin America as a young man. But I'm constantly, reading up on what's going on. And obviously in the last few weeks, last few months, things have ramped up because of the elections. And we are facing an interesting time, just watching what is unraveling. So perhaps you could give us a little bit of background on these the final round between Bernardo Arevalo and Sandra Torres.
Right. So, I think the headline here is that the outcome of the elections were quite a surprise to virtually all Guatemalan observers, long-term and short-term observers of Guatemala. Arevalo was polling, something like 3% in the public opinion polls. Not that they're necessarily all that reliable in Guatemala, but and there were 6 or 7 candidates polling well ahead of him, all of them at some point or other connected to the very conservative, very corrupt networks that currently hold power. And it was, I think, all of our assumption that one or another of those candidates were going to be the ones making it into the second round. And so it would be, as Vargas Llosa once said with regards to an election in Peru, AIDS versus cancer. None of the outcomes were going to be good. And lo and behold, Suri Rios, for example, for many people were very concerned. Suri Rios, the daughter of genocidaire Efraín Rios Montt, was polling, fairly well. She was expected to possibly make it into the second round. She came in 6th, 7th, if you count the people who didn't, who spoiled their ballots. So that was also a surprise. So I think that's the top story, the surprising result of Bernardo Arevalo coming in second place and competing, going to be the person to compete in the second round against Sandra Torres, who is, of course, an old political part of the political establishment in Guatemala. She's the former first lady. Her husband was president. Alvaro Colom was president many years ago. This is her third attempt to be president. But what we've seen since then has been a very determined effort on the part of the sectors who control power to essentially erase Bernardo Arevalo and his party Semilla from the electoral map. One judge accused his party of falsifying signatures to register as a formal party and therefore ordered the suspension of the party of its legal status. The Attorney General's office then proceeded to move on that judicial ruling. And then, of course, Arevalo and his party filed an injunction. And so it's been this kind of it's actually very hard to keep up with the judicial ping pong that's been going on in the days since the first round. Well, really since the judge and the MP, the prosecutor's office have been trying to shut down the Semilla party. But we are hoping that the elections will, in fact, take place with Sandra Torres versus Bernardo Arevalo on August 20th, 20 days to go. So there's still 3 weeks. It's a very uncertain climate. There's a lot of tension, but there's also a tremendous amount of hope. And this is a word I have not used in a sentence about Guatemala in a very long time, right? So there's something that's very exciting about the whole situation. At the same time, that there's a lot of reasons to be worried.
Yes, and this is what I was feeling at the same time. Is like, okay, you have let's say, the political elite establishment, same old business in Sandra Torres on one side, the Unidad Nacional de Esperanza, and then of course you've got Bernardo Arevalo, very symbolic character due to his family ties, and everything up against him. But can you imagine the hope of someone from outside of the establishment getting in, just ruffling up some feathers? I'm supposing that should he win, should he be allowed to win? Should he win? Should the elections take place? There's a lot of shoulds there.
There's a lot of ifs there, yeah.
But should he win, he wouldn't have a majority to be able to push through all sorts of changes and reforms that he would like to do so. But he could. It would be change in itself. And I was looking at this, accusations of him having sort of dead people signed up for his party in 2019. It sounds quite spurious, this one. Can we lend any authority to these accusations, or is it all entirely sort of politically biased campaigning?
Oh, I think that it's really politically motivated. Okay. There's often irregularities in any elections process. We know that from, the United States as well, right? That's not an unnormal occurrence for there to be some problems, some irregularities, but systematic, But what's really happening is that judges and prosecutors who are extremely close allies of the present regime, right? They're the ones who are pursuing these efforts to have Semilla party canceled. And I think that, and they're not, the fact is these are not people who just kind of have popped up. These are people who have been systematically engaged in corrupt and anti-democratic actions for quite some time now. So just to give you an example, the judge who ordered the suspension of Semilla is also the judge who was involved in the case against Jose Ruben Zamora, the publisher and owner and editor of El Periódico, Guatemala's most important daily newspaper, which no longer exists because he was arrested about a year ago. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison on absolutely spurious charges. And the judge and the prosecutor who have accused Semilla were recently, I should say, designated by the U.S. government, by the U.S. State Department on the Engels list, which is a list of people who are sanctioned by the U.S. as a very serious sanction of individuals who are deemed to be corrupt and or non-democratic actors. And so, these are it's not just some judge or some prosecutor, right? These are people who have a long history of engaging in quite dubious actions designed to undermine rule of law, undermine Guatemalan democracy, difficult, it's as challenged as it is, etc. So I think that's the thing that we need to think about here.
So this small but incredibly powerful, incredibly entrenched elite. Okay, we talk about corruption, and I guess we talk about Guatemala as a transit country for illicit goods and so on. But what do they really all stand to gain out of this serious continuing backslide of the democratic process within Guatemala? Sorry.
Within Guatemala, I think it's important to sort of step back a little bit and sort of look at the last several years of what's happened in Guatemala, because I think that's the only way you can understand what's happening right now. So Guatemala experienced a very unique period. Some people call it the judicial spring, which is a play on the word democratic spring, which was inaugurated in 1944 by Bernardo Arevalo's father, who you alluded to a moment ago, the first democratically elected president in Guatemala's history, right? Juan Jose Arevalo. And that 10-year experiment of democratic spring was brought to a brutal end in 1954 with the CIA-sponsored coup against his successor, Jacobo Arbenz, a story many of us are familiar with. But in around 2006, 2007, the United Nations set up this body in Guatemala, the International Commission Against Impunity, CICIG. And along with some very dynamic and trailblazing prosecutors and judges, CICIG became, it really led a unique experiment in trying to rebuild or build really the rule of law, to deal with the long-standing problem of impunity and corruption in Guatemala, and impunity for present crimes primarily. And there's also impunity for past crimes, which also began to advance while CICIG was in Guatemala, though CICIG didn't really have a mandate to engage in those kinds of cases. So I'm thinking about the trial against Rios Montt and other trials. But the CICIG's mandate is really focused on present day organized crime, corruption, and political crimes. When I say political crimes, I mean things like illicit campaign contributions, right? And so CICIG began a very rigorous process of strengthening judicial and prosecutorial independence, autonomy, improving their investigative skills, improving security, a whole slew of reforms and trainings and so forth, that really did help strengthen, like I said, autonomy and independence of both the prosecutor's office and the judiciary. But what was also key, of course, is that there are these trailblazing new faces in the Attorney General's office, people like Claudia Paz y Paz, later Tel Maldana, both the Attorney Generals back to back. In the judiciary also, they created special courts to deal with very complex crimes, including organized crime, corruption, drug trafficking, gang violence, and of course, human rights abuses as well. That had greater levels of security, protection, training, and so forth. So in the course of these, the 10 or 15 years that CICIG was in, it was like around 12 years that CICIG was in Guatemala, it was sort of this unprecedented effort to strengthen the judiciary, strengthen rule of law, and combat corruption and impunity. The problem was, as many people have noted, they got to be a little too good at their job. And at some point, they weren't just investigating this politician, that politician. I mean, they put a president behind bars, they put a vice president behind bars, Otto Perez Molina, Roxana Valdetti, several government ministers. But at some point, their investigations turned to the economic elites. And several members of Guatemala's, very powerful economic elites were being investigated for illicit campaign contributions. And at that point, the elites is enough is enough. And so you begin to see this kind of concert of interests congealing, military folks who are angry about human rights prosecutions going on in Guatemala, conservative politicians who are angry that many of their allies either have been prosecuted or are being investigated or could be investigated, and the economic elites who have now been touched by CICIG. So there's this confluence of interests. In Guatemala, it's known as the Pact of the Corrupt, el Pacto de los Corruptos, which start trying to roll back this incredible experiment in accountability in Guatemala.
Wow.
And so in 2019, in effect, CICIG is shut down unilaterally by the Guatemalan government. They close their doors, and thus begins the slow rollback of everything that had been gained up until that point. And so between 2019 and 2023, which is essentially the time period of this, Giammattei came in, I believe, in 2020. Mm-hmm. So it's basically the last, 3.5 years of the Giammattei government have been an effort to consolidate this pact of the corrupt, to consolidate their power, to assert their influence and control over virtually every state institution. And they've largely achieved that, which is one of the reasons why people were fearful that the elections themselves were not going to be free and fair. And I think it is important to say that the Supreme Elections Tribunal, which is now being hailed as sort of the heroes of this process, because they are defending the right of Arevalo to run in the second round elections, but they also canceled 3 presidential candidates, including Telma Cabrera, from an indigenous community leader who came in 4th in Guatemala's last election. They canceled her on a very spurious charge involving her vice presidential candidate Jordan Rodas, who was the former human rights ombudsman. And they canceled 2 other, Roberto Arzu of the right, and Carlos Pineda, someone with allegedly shady background, but who was starting to rise in the polls. And they canceled him as well. And they didn't cancel Bernardo Arevalo, I think many of us believe, because he was not registering really in the polls. He was like getting 2 or 3% in the polls. So at the time Guatemalans go to the polls on June, I believe it was 25th, your choices are Suri Rios, Manuel Conde, who is Yamate's candidate, the party candidate. It's Sandra Torres, who herself was facing a corruption charges a couple of years ago and somehow managed to get her way out of that, and a few others. And what happened is, most of Guatemalans actually voted for nobody, right? Many Guatemalans simply didn't turn out to vote, and the number one vote getter in the actual paper ballots was nobody. People either spoiled their ballot or they didn't choose anybody. So that's the number one voter. And then it was Sandra Torres with something like, 15 or 16%, followed by Arevalo with something like 12%. And then all the others well below that. So this surprise candidate comes to the fore, and suddenly the whole game has changed. And the elites, this pact of the corrupt, are utterly taken off guard. They did not expect this. They believed they had these elections in the bag, one or the other. Maybe not Yamate's candidate, but they knew they could work out a deal with Suri Rios or with any of the other multiple conservative and allied candidates of this pact. They would work it out somehow. So now what's happening is there's 2 things going on. One is they're trying to cancel Semilla to get, and that's still ongoing. There's a temporary injunction, but the Attorney General's office is still investigating, and there still is the risk that they could legally, not legally, but suspend their legal status. It would not be legal to do so. It's actually not legal to do that. And these corrupt sectors are working Sandra Torres to make sure that first of all, to make sure that she wins, so that they don't even have to deal with Arevalo, and that if she wins, they have a very clear agreement with her that their impunity and their power remains intact. That's how I see what's happening right now.
A perfect storm of all these things coming together. But at the same time, as you say, the elites really, became legless by getting rid of those 3 other candidates that they would have been able to have dealt with. Because, I assume that, I know that Roberto Arzu must be, Alvaro Arzu's son. Because we're looking at, I'm thinking of the list of presidents, Portillo, Berga, Arzu, Colom, Giammattei, Morales. They all represented, didn't they? They all represented these interests. And so you've got all of these characters, and you start to see the same surnames over and over, the same characters. And yet they really, they messed it up for themselves. And now what do you do? As you said, you're trying to, so this puts another, and I hadn't thought of this, but of course, if this ongoing Attorney General investigation and potential suspension of the Semilla party and Arevalo wins, could they then overturn, his victory in an election if this takes place? Legally,
they could not do that.
But it doesn't seem to have stopped them previously.
Right. This is an unprecedented situation, so it's not something we've seen before necessarily. But I don't doubt that they would go to every length possible to prevent a Semilla victory. What has been quite stunning to me has been the massive international response calling on Guatemala, exhorting Guatemala to respect the election results, knowing all the flaws that went into that process, and allow Guatemalans to vote. So that's really been something to the United Nations, the United States government, European governments, the EU, the OAS. I think the Secretary General of the OAS is in Guatemala as we speak. Latin American governments. I mean, Uribe actually signed a letter with a bunch of other conservative Latin American presidents calling on Guatemala to ensure free and fair elections, when Uribe is, historically been a very close ally of these very sectors that are trying to cancel Semilla. It's really quite fascinating. Although it is important to say, there are divisions and conflicts within these elite groups. It's very difficult to trace all that and to understand what's happening. But for example, maybe a week or so ago, Ricardo Mendez Ruiz, who is the president of the Foundation Against Terrorism,
yes, that's it,
which is a pro-military organization set up in 2013 to counter the organizations and the Attorney General's office that were prosecuting Rios Montt for genocide. And it's since grown into essentially the right arm of the Attorney General's office. I mean, everyone that I know sees it that way anyway. And Ricardo Mendez Ruiz tweeted something about criticizing President Giammattei for allowing his sort of key advisor, reported friend, let's just say, Miguel Martinez, of what's the word I'm looking for? Of getting involved in decisions about promotions within the Guatemalan Armed Forces. And as someone who's very close to the Guatemalan military, including the old guard, right, retired generals, Mendez Ruiz presumably is speaking for them, saying, "Yo, Giammattei, you're getting your nose in where it doesn't belong." So there are definitely divisions going on. Sometimes it's not very clear what's happening, but that's another thing to keep in mind as well. So when there are divisions among elite groups, that's an opportunity for reformers, for civil society, for social movements to push, to pressure for change. And so this moment is particularly, I think, ripe for the kind of change that Bernardo Arevalo would represent. Given, though, what you said before, that if he were to win, he does not have anything close to a majority in Congress. Congress is going to be controlled by these different right-wing and / corrupt parties. So it's going to be a very difficult slog for him should he, in fact, become the president of Guatemala.
I mean, truly fascinating. There's a League Against Terrorism, and of course the link there to Uribe in Colombia, and of course another nice link is the CICIG's guy Ivan Velasquez, who of course is a real bugbear for Uribe down here in Colombia, being the current Minister of Defense, who was then declared persona non grata in Guatemala when he went after Jimmy Morales back in the day. So the links are quite strong. I like to go back a little bit and put this into context, not only of the region, but when we talk about the sort of toppling of Jacobo Arbenz back in '54, and it was the CIA-backed coup out of Honduras, I think, and they got up into Zacapa, like the rum, Zacapa, and that's when Arbenz sort of said, I quit and went into exile in France, and this is all major Cold War machinations taking place. Are we still? I mean, are the elites still fighting the Cold War? Because when you look at the things that what you were talking about, Ruiz, I've seen the billboards that he's got up there, and he's talking about Venezuela and everything turning into a new Venezuela, and that seems to be Latin America's greatest, example.
It's the classic trope of the Latin American right to try to discredit anyone from center to left of being the next Hugo Chavez or the next Nicolás Maduro. I mean, I work in Peru as well, and I've seen it. It's in 2011 against Ollantaytamala, the main argument of the right wing and the elites was, oh, he's going to be a Chavista, and that Peru's going to become another Venezuela, which of course it did not under Humala. On the contrary. And so I just think that that's a classic trope of the right in Latin America at this point. I think a lot of that has become very globalized. Those discourse, like gender ideology, it's something that the right all over the region is using now. Yeah, I guess I lost my train of thought on that point, but yeah, well, I'll just leave it at that.
That's fine.
I'm sorry. I remember now. You had asked me about the Cold. Is Guatemala still fighting the Cold War? And I did have a point to make about that, because one of the things that I do in Guatemala is I research war crimes prosecutions.
Sure.
Right. So I'm sitting, me or my team are sitting in, courtrooms where former military, retired military officials or soldiers or paramilitaries are being accused and prosecuted for a series of crimes against humanity, whether it's torture, sexual violence, forced disappearance, massacres, etc. And the discourse that you hear all the time is that from the right, from the military, from conservative sectors, is that the people who were defeated, supposedly the guerrillas, are now fighting the war in the courts. And so in their mind, yes, indeed, the Cold War is still being fought. It's just the terrain has shifted. But beyond those courtroom scenarios, I think that in general, the right in Guatemala still very much has sort of that Cold War mentality. Although I think it's more, like I said before, it's more of a trope. It's more of a discourse than anything else. I mean, because who exactly are they fighting? I mean, to pretend that Semilla is, communist or guerrilla, it's absurd. It is a centrist political party that's participated in elections. Yes, they were active in the anti-corruption protests against Pérez Molina in 2015, which resulted in his stepping down and being arrested, right? Many folks didn't like that on that side of the fence. But it's really absurd. It's really absurd, but it's real. I mean, it is real, a real part of the discourse. And the consequences are real, because when you have power behind you, when you have the power of the courts, when you have the power of the Attorney General's office, when you have the power of the social media that Mendez Ruiz, through his different online accounts, has to attack people, to indict people, and in some cases to actually arrest people, or alternatively to force them into exile. I'm sure you're aware that there are now dozens of Guatemalan judges and prosecutors, mostly people involved in anti-corruption investigations or trials, are now in exile. Yeah. As are countless journalists, human rights defenders, and so forth. So though the Cold War discourse it seems bizarre and unreal, because it is backed by power and lawfare, the consequences for Guatemalans who are actually trying to change things is very real. Or not even trying to change, just trying to do their job. The prosecutors who, were investigating corruption, they're just doing their job. And now, dozens of them live, in Washington, D.C. and Costa Rica and Mexico and so on and so forth.
That's it. I saw the figure 30 plus prosecutors and judges, journalists forced into exile or jailed. And there have been 750 threats against journalists that have been reported that so far in this period. But when we put it, moving from a Cold War standpoint, but let's move it in this kind of last phase of our conversation into a regional standpoint, because we have a backslide in Guatemala, but we have a political elite who just kind of want business as usual. Whereas if we look at the rest of the region, we've had a slow steady slide into dictatorship in Nicaragua, and then you've had a kind of breakneck speed slide into, authoritarian regime in El Salvador. You knew I was going to say
Absolutely.
that. And then you've got, Xiomara Castro looking at El Salvador as well, it seems. Guatemala not likely to take this kind of road, or is there a fear?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish. There are different kinds of authoritarian systems, right? So the two that you pointed to, Nicaragua and El Salvador, as it turns out, are extremely personalized dictatorships.
Yes.
Right? We see the person, we know their name, we know who they are. It's Ortega and his wife Murillo, and in the case of El Salvador, it's Bukele. In Guatemala, it's really a corporate system. The authoritarian system that has been installed in Guatemala, or that is being installed, partially installed. It's always one of these things that, how authoritarian is Guatemala? If there are elections and there's a chance that Arevalo could win, it's not 100% authoritarian, is it? Unless they stop him from winning, which then, oh yeah, maybe it is. It's one of these things that, it's difficult to come to a concrete, I think, definition. But the way I see it is that the rule of law has been eroded to the point where it's nearly impossible to qualify Guatemala as a democracy. At best, it's an authoritarian system where there are still elections. And what we hope comes out of this process, right, is that if Arevalo wins and takes power, what we hope is that there can be a restoration of rule of law in Guatemala, because without rule of law, there is no democracy. Even if there are elections, it's still not a democracy. There's it's an old trope, the fallacy of electoral democracy. Just because there are elections doesn't mean it's a democracy. There have to be a whole slew of other conditions, and I think one of the most important ones is rule of law. So without rule of law, which right now it's, and you can see it in this back and forth ping pong between the judges, the prosecutors, and the Semilla party, you can see how difficult it is. It is illegal for a judge to cancel the legal status of a political party once the electoral process has taken place. It's in the ley de partidos. It's a law, and yet there they are canceling Semilla. So that's what I mean when I say rule of law is not very effective in Guatemala. And when the elites, the last thing to add, and when the elites control, they control virtually the entire judicial system. They control the Attorney General's office. They control the Supreme Court. They control the Constitutional Court. People understand that there is a margin of independence for actors in those places to act according to the law. Now, whether that's going to happen in the next few weeks remains to be seen. The TSE, the Supreme Tribunal, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, has surprised many of us, because we were all complaining, as I said a moment ago, about the decision to suspend the candidacies of 3 key individuals in these elections. That's a really problematic pattern of behavior on the part of those authorities. And yet when it came to this effort to cancel Semilla party, they responded according to the law. They resisted those efforts. So that's what you want to see, right? You want to see space for individuals in these different, institutions to uphold the rule of law. Otherwise, it's going to be a slide into this kind of corporate authoritarian system that is going to be very difficult to reverse.
Corporate authoritarian system. It sounds terrifying. But the last point I was going to bring up was the TSE. I mean, we are surprised. We have been surprised. One would have expected them to toe the line. I mean, forgive me for being so negative about it, but one would have expected in this situation. But so I think we are obviously on the threshold of change or much of the same business as usual in Guatemala.
But I think what's so extraordinary is that the vote, the way people voted, forced the TSE officials to act in this surprising way, correctly. right? And that's that's an incredible thing, right? To see the force of democracy actually, pushing institutions that in some ways have been co-opted to do the right thing. It's incredible. We hope that continues, sincerely.
And finally, if should these Sandra Torres win, or even either, obviously one's going to win, are the people going to take to the streets? Are we going to see unrest or violence? I think if either way, if it doesn't go according to whichever party hopes.
Right. That's a good question. If Arevalo wins, I don't think people will go into the street to protest. I think there might be other kind of actions in protest, right? But maybe not. Maybe they'll say, okay, we've got to deal with this. The international pressure is such that, okay, we're going to let this guy have, but we have all the other institutions. So we are going to asphyxiate him. And there's precedents for this. Peru, Pedro Castillo, not a great president, but that's exactly what they did to him, right? Yep. And look where he is now, in jail. Yep. And the right now controls Peru. That's one model. If Sandra Torres wins, I don't see, this is not a radical, it's a centrist anti-corruption party. They are not going to, they may protest, but it's going to be peaceful protests. I don't see necessarily the likelihood of violence should either of these two win. Where I see the possibility for violence and real instability is if the power structure that currently holds the reins of power in Guatemala prevents these elections from taking place, or there is a clear effort to alter the outcome. That's where I see danger. So think we could just let things go. Either way, they don't have it bad. They don't have total control, but they still have a lot of control. Yeah. So.
Well, I think there's no better place than to end it there. Has been enlightening to talk with someone who has it so clear what's going on in clearly a very complex situation between the two parties, the two interests in Guatemala at the moment. So let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Professor Jo-Marie Burt of the School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and the president of LASA. It really has been a distinct pleasure hearing your thoughts on what's going on in Guatemala at the moment.
Thank you, Richard, for having me and for taking time to talk about Guatemala. It's so important that international eyes are on what's going on here right now. So thank you for that.
You're most welcome. This has been episode 10 of the Latin News Podcast. I've been your host, Richard McCall. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back in a fortnight with a further interview about episodes and goings on in the region. Bye-bye.